Does van Inwagen's argument work? Let's look at these premises again, and let's look at this term that appears in the premises. The term Damien could have done this or could have done that. What does it mean to say somebody could have done something? So there are different things that we might mean when we say that you could have done something. Here's one thing that you might mean. First, if you'd wished to do it, then you would have done it. That's what we mean when we say you could have done it. If you'd wished to do it, then you would have done it. The action was under the control of your desires in that sense. So it didn't happen because you didn't wish it to happen. But if you had wished it to happen, it would have happened. Second thing we might mean by saying you could have done something. There was nothing that stood in the way of your doing it. There was no obstacle, no barrier. It wasn't like there was a brick wall in front of you that prevented you from doing it. It wasn't like there was somebody holding you and gripping you by the arms, preventing you from doing it. Nothing physical stood in the way of your doing it. Here is a third thing you might mean by saying you could have done something. It made sense for you to consider it an option. When you were thinking about what to do, if you had thought about what to do, and you sort of mulled over your options, it would have made sense for you to consider this one as one of your options. Okay, so there are different ways to disambiguate this, all this talk of what Damien could or couldn't have done. Let's try and see whether, when we specify which sense of could have done we've got in mind, the premises make sense. Let's focus on premises 3 and 4. Premise 3 says Damien could not have made it the case that the laws of nature were different, and premise 4 says he could not have made it the case that the initial conditions of the world were different. Are those premises true when we understand this talk of what Damien could or couldn't have done in the first sense? Well, I take it that the premises come out false when we understand premises 3 and 4 in this sense that Damien could have done it means if he'd wished to do it, then he would have done it. So is it true that Damien could not have changed the laws and made the laws different or the initial conditions different? Maybe, as a matter of fact, he never wished in our world for the laws to be different or the initial conditions to be different. If he had wished for the laws to be different and the initial conditions to be different, then, as a matter of fact, they would have to have been different, because the laws and the initial conditions necessitated that he wouldn't wish that they were different. So if he had wished they were different, they would have to have been different. So, rather surprisingly, in the first sense of could have, premise 3 and 4 come out false, or at least one of them does. If Damien had wished that the laws were different, or that the initial conditions were different, then one of the laws or the initial conditions would have to have been different. So he could have made it the case that the laws were different or the initial conditions were different. What if we understand could have done otherwise in the second way, in terms of a physical obstacle standing in the way of Damien? Do premises 3 and 4 come out true when we understand it that way? Well, so the issue is whether a physical obstacle stood in the way of Damien and his not taking the bill. Now, clearly there was no beast holding his arms, forcing him to take the bill. It wasn't like there was some kind of a brick wall that somehow stood between him and not taking the bill. So nothing physical like that stood in the way of his not taking the bill and thereby making the laws different or the initial conditions different. You might think that the laws themselves are kind of like the beast. They restrain Damien in doing what he's doing. But in thinking that, you're basically assuming the conclusion of the argument that we have at stake, the argument that we're focusing on here, namely that because determinism is true, Damien is constrained by the laws and he can't do anything other than he does. And so this argument is going to become unpersuasive if we just allow ourselves the assumption that the laws and the initial conditions are a physical obstacle that restrains him in just the way that a beast might restrain you or a wall might restrain you. So it doesn't look at all obvious if we understand could have done otherwise in the second way that premises 3 and 4 are going to be acceptable. the reading on which premise 3 and 4 make perfect sense and come out as unambiguously true is the reading of could have done otherwise. That's the third one. The one that has us wonder whether it made sense for Damien to consider breaking the laws or changing the initial conditions to be an option. Certainly, it made no sense for him to consider it to be an option. Imagine first that Damien had no idea what the laws and the initial conditions were, but we just asked him, here's something you can do. Maybe I'll give you an incentive to do it, Damien. I'll give you $30 if you can change the laws or change the initial conditions. Make it so that the laws or the initial conditions are different from the way that they actually were. Damien would quite rightly look at you and go, that's crazy. Whatever I do, the laws of nature and the initial conditions are going to be set in such a way that I do it. There's nothing I can do to make it so that the laws of nature or the initial conditions are different from the way they actually are. This is not the kind of goal I can reasonably hope to attain. And things don't get any better if I tell Damien what the laws are and tell him what the initial conditions are. Suppose I tell him that the laws are laws L and the initial conditions are initial conditions I, and I specify in great detail what those are. And I say, Damien, if you can make it the case that those laws L are not the laws, or those initial conditions I are not the initial conditions, then I'll give you your money. Damien will rightly respond, whatever I do, it's going to turn out that that's what would have been predicted by the laws and the initial conditions. So whatever I do, it's going to turn out that it's consistent with those laws and those initial conditions. Now, this shows that Damien can't sensibly aim to make it the case that the laws are different or make it the case that the initial conditions are different. But of course, it's perfectly consistent with that he's going to be able to look back and say, gosh, if I'd wanted to do something else, I would have done the something else. And also that he can look back and say, no physical obstacle stood in the way of my doing something else. Even though, as a matter of fact, I acted in a way that was consistent with the laws and the initial conditions, and it made no sense for me to aim to act any other way. Nonetheless, when I look back, if I'd wanted differently, I would have behaved differently.